was a fairly prosperous country real estate broker, enjoying a good life. But deep down, let me say this, I had already done a good bit of coaching of lacrosse in my life and done some part-time teaching in the evenings. But deep down, what I really wanted was to become a full-time teacher and a full-time coach. But the opportunity wasn't that easy, wasn't that available. Loyola High School had invited me, because I had coached there in the 60s. They had invited me to be a teacher at Loyola, but as soon as I said, look, I would accept this, but there's only one problem. The only thing I want to teach is the Russian culture, history, and the Russian language, and you don't have that. He said, no, that's true, we don't. Well, in 1969, out of the blue, I received a phone call from John Carroll, from the late Father Charles Reed. And he said, we're looking for a lacrosse coach. How about it? He said, I know that you've coached at Loyola, and we'd like to have you at John Carroll. And I said, well, Father Reed, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told them, that I really am not interested in combining the business world with the education world. It's too much of a problem. If I could come to John Carroll and teach what I want to teach, I would. I would coach lacrosse, and I would do that. He said, well, what is it that you want to teach? And I said, something you don't have, Russian language and Russian history. He said, no problem, we'll put it in. So it was that simple. In 1970, in September of 1970, I had my first Russian class at John Carroll. I was on the faculty, and I was the lacrosse coach. And I owe such a debt of gratitude to the late Father Reed. He had, he just had this, it was fortuitous that it happened. I really do think that God has a plan for each one of us. And I guess that phone call was meant to be. And I thank him to this day for giving me the opportunity of taking students to Russia, particularly during those Cold War years, when we knew that there wasn't much love for Americans. When I took students over there to have that experience of being in that environment, and it wasn't all very pleasant. Some of it was, but not all of it was. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I'm saying. That we were invited as a group we were guests of an editor of one of the local papers, and he had translated it into English so we could all read it. Well, I was browsing through it, and I saw where the United States makes toy bombs, sends them to Afghanistan, and when the children open them, they explode, and the children are killed or maimed for life. And I raised my hand and I said, do you really believe that? He said, we know it. We know it's a fact that your country does this. And then they blame the Soviet Union. So I just said to the kids, I said, let's go, get up, we're leaving. And we did, we walked out of there. Another time, in fact, this was the very first time that we ever went to the Soviet Union. It was the first morning we were taken to a beautiful cathedral in downtown, what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. And I thought, this is really going to be beautiful. I want to see the inside of this cathedral. Well, we got in, and in those days, most Christian churches, I should have expected this. Most Christian churches, Orthodox churches, had been converted to museums, parking lots, whatever. So we get into this cathedral, and it's a cathedral about atheism and depicting all the fallacies and evils of Christianity. And it was so insulting that the arguments, we were so incensed that along with me was the football coach at John Carroll, Jerry Gray. Many of you have heard of Mr. Gray and Mr. Gray's stories. And Jerry was so upset that if we hadn't gotten him out of that cathedral, I think we would have seen the beginning of World War III. And these were the kind of experiences that our kids were being subjected to, and they weren't all unpleasant. An example of a very inspirational and pleasant one was the Soviets never wanted you to see anything other than the bright lights of the great Soviet society. But I prevailed upon this guide to take us out and show us a real Russian village, and it was only a half hour outside of St. Petersburg. And when we went into the village, unpaved roads, mostly old log houses, but this old gentleman came over to the bus and he wanted to know who we were and what we were doing in the village. And I told him we were Americans, and he was beside himself. I think he hugged every one of us and told us that he was so happy that an American would come and visit their village. He invited us into his house. He had been fishing that morning, and he was so proud to show us his catch. And icons hanging on the wall. I mean, here was another Russia so totally different from the Russia in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. And I think it was Winston Churchill who said that Russia is a riddle inside of an enigma wrapped up in a mystery. And that was so true, that you never knew what to expect. But these were the kind of experiences that our kids had. And I'll just tell you one more thing, because I know it's getting on, but I think this has some good humor to it. In 1987, I had been taking students to Russia since 1973. Well, this is 1987, and Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev had a summit meeting, and they were trying to find a way or ways to improve relationships between the two countries, and to try to improve a better understanding among the peoples. And they came up with the idea, let's start with young people. So the idea was born. They started with just a half a dozen schools with the idea, let's try it and see how it works. Somehow or other, we got word, and I applied for it. Well, we didn't know whether we would be accepted or not, but the evaluation was scheduled for a Monday morning. This is the honest to goodness truth. That weekend, there had been a big party in the school. I think it was an auction. Well, Mr. Sudbrink, God rest his soul, must have forgotten to tell the maintenance people to clean up over the weekend. And Monday morning, when I walked into school, it was a sight that you wouldn't want to see. There were trash all over the place, and here I had a delegation from Russia due in to evaluate not only me, but the school, the class. So if you know the physical plant at John Carroll, I had one of the teachers meet them outside, bring them up the back way where the ramp is, past the kitchen, and bring them up to my room that way so they wouldn't have to go through the academic wing. So we got past that obstacle. And the next obstacle was I noticed this one woman who seemed to be the spokesman for the group. I don't think she knew what the word smile meant. I mean, she was all business. And I was conducting the class, and kids were doing their thing. And she stopped me and she said, before we complete our evaluation, I want to hear one of your students stand up and read Russian. I had nothing to do with who she pointed out. She just happened to point out a girl by the name of, I'll never forget her name, Deborah Dobrovakis. And Deborah she was bilingual. It was Lithuanian, but most Lithuanian people know Russian. And she read like a scholar. So I knew we were in. So we were one of the 5 or 6 in 1987 who were chosen, selected to go to Russia, and we couldn't stay with their families. We couldn't go in their houses. That was still to come later. But we were allowed to spend every day in school, in the classroom, with the kids, and we played basketball, and we played games with them, and we sang with them, and it was just a great experience. And before we came home, things had gotten along so well that, and this was big news in Russia, that they invited every kid, allowed every one of our students to spend an evening in the home of a Russian family. Well, that was an American in your home. That was big. That was a first. And so when we came back, it had been such a success that they decided that the next time that they did this, 2 years hence in 1989, there would be 30 schools included. And of course, since we had already been selected, we were included in that group. But one of our students, by the name of Dustin Pons, maybe some of you know the Pons family. Well, Dustin had been with us on that 87 experience, and he and I were invited to Washington to meet with a couple of people from the National Press Club and to talk on Voice of America. And we did just that. And not too long after that, Justin got a beautiful letter from a youngster in Leningrad saying that we heard you on Voice of America, and you said such great things about our country, and it was just, you knew that the ice had been broken. So what Gorbachev and Reagan had hoped to happen did happen, and we were a big part of it. So that was probably one of the biggest thrills that I've had in the 40 years that I've been involved. I will just leave this one last thought. I would like for my legacy to be, now that Russian will be finished in two more months, I would love to see John Carroll seriously consider Arabic. I think it's one of the most necessary language today in education, and maybe, who knows, maybe it'll happen.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Once again, the World Languages Department would like to offer very sincere congratulations to all of tonight's new Language Honor Society members. We now invite the new inductees and their guests